people live in the present. They plan and worry about the future. I mean, we tend to divide life into past, present, and future. But the past gets little regard because I'm overwhelmed where I'm at in the present. There's so much here. And then we think about the future and what's next and what's ahead, and we're worrying about all of that. A lot of people live like, why would I even bother with what happened in the past? It's past, it's gone, I can't do anything about it. It's history. A philosopher from a century ago captured some sense of the importance of history. George Santayana is his name, and he said this: those who cannot learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. The biggest reason that we would look at history and study it is so that we don't make the same mistakes as they made back there or as we made. How many people seem to make the same mistakes over and over again? They don't ever learn from those mistakes. History explains how the world is. How did we arrive where we are? History explains why there's a North and a South Korea. Why there's a West Virginia and a regular Virginia. Why Iran is who they are. It explains how the world is. History provides moral lessons. It talks to us about how to deal with tyrants and what happens when a leader abuses power. How democracy is the greatest engine of prosperity that the world has ever seen. How George Washington walked away from power, the first person in human history to walk away at the height of his power and give it up to the next person that came along after 2 terms. How violent and oppressive every communist regime in history has ever been. Yet we see a lack of awareness of history when there's people protesting for socialism and more government control when it's never worked in the history of the world. History provides a laboratory for human behavior. What happens if you put a group of people in a certain place with these resources and this experience? What happens to them? We don't have to write fiction books like Lord of the Flies. We just have to look at certain countries or groups of people from history. It's full of examples, the laboratory of life. How will they act? What will happen? What will become of the people in charge? That's already been done. History, the importance of history. History also gives us a glimpse into the future because it tends to repeat itself. Tyrants rise and tyrants are brought down of their own undoing because people don't really learn from their own mistakes or the mistakes of others. In 1 Corinthians 10, in verse 6, it tries to lay out for us about the experiences of the past. And in 1 Corinthians 10, it's a listing of several events from the Old Testament, the Israelites. And it says this: these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things like they lusted after. Talking about the Israelites and their unhealthy desires. Well, a couple verses later, it says again in verse 11, these things happened to them, the Israelites, as examples for us so that we would learn from their history and learn from their example and not make the same mistakes. They were written for our own admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Now, as we go back to the book of Exodus, one of the themes that has arisen in the redemption story, the Exodus story, is that the Israelites were freed from the slavery of Egypt, but they needed to be freed from themselves as well, because we have discovered that the oppressed have been exposed as sinners. Their hearts have been revealed to us as well. And they have a history of complaining. At the point where we are in Exodus 17, this is the 5th time that they've been revealed to be complainers. Clear back in chapter 5, they were complaining about the added workload that they had when Moses went in and demanded that they, to the Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh was like, hey, if you got time to go out and worship, then you have time to make bricks and gather your own straw too. I'm piling on the work for you guys. And then a few weeks ago, we studied when they arrived at the Red Sea. And sure enough, they're up against the Red Sea and the Egyptians are coming. And their first thought isn't, this is great news. This will be an opportunity for God to do a miracle. And we're living in the midst of a miracle. No, they complain. And why did you bring us here? And it would have been better to die back there in Egypt. And wasn't the food great back there? And a third time, and we actually have skipped over it. We don't even have time to study all their complaints, if you can think of that. And it was at chapter 15, just days after the Red Sea. They arrive at a pool of water, and the water's bitter. And so instead of saying, hey, I can't wait to see how God works this out, this is a great opportunity, they say, what did he bring us out here for? What are you doing, God? You don't know what you're doing. And it was at the bitter waters of Marah. And at the bitter waters of Marah, a fascinating phrase in chapter 15, it says, God showed him a tree. And he cast the tree in the waters, and the waters became sweet. And they were able to drink the water and be refreshed there. And it was a great illustration, because when did God ever show people a tree to turn bitter into sweet? It's a beautiful picture of the cross and the salvation that it provides, and it changes the bitterness of our sin into the sweetness of our salvation. Well, last week we studied the manna. They were hungry out there in the wilderness. They'd been out there on their own for about 4 weeks. It's all it was, and it had only been a couple weeks since the Red Sea, and their first response was complaining. Again, they don't learn from their history that God is delivered, God is delivered, God is delivered, God is faithful, God is faithful, God is faithful. And at the next sign of adversity, they complain again. I remember at some point in my life, I realized what a complainer I was, and it was long after my mom's stopped singing to me, which some of I had mentioned last week. And there's been a lot of demands that I sing that song again, or maybe try my hand at another song. A lot of you have been asking, but we're not going to go there probably ever again. So last week was going to be it. But I remember at some point coming to realize I complain about every hardship that comes. The next time I want to trust God when it starts showing up. God, help me recognize that it's a test, a challenge, and to not whine about it from the beginning, but to trust you and see the opportunity. Because we come to number 5 in our sequence, and it's they get thirsty again. It's a time of thirst, and we're going to read that. But let me mention, if you were to continue on in the book of Exodus, and then read in Numbers, which advances the story chronologically, what you'll find is several more times that the people complain about the situation they're in rather than trust God. And I just want us to learn the lesson sooner. It doesn't stop the challenges from coming, but it changes our entire outlook, and it changes how we handle them. And certainly if we're not complaining, it makes us a little more pleasant to be around, if nothing else. Let's follow along, please. Exodus 17. I'm going to read 1 through 7 in this account. Now then all the congregation of the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin, according to the commandment of the Lord. And it camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people contended with Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." So Moses said to them, "Why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord your God?" And the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why is it that you brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Go on before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel. Also take in your hand your rod with which you struck the river and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it that the people may drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah because of the contention of the people of Israel, because they tempted the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Now, as we look at Israel and their history, and we could probably put your history, you could put mine in here, you find that there's a pattern, a cycle, a complaint cycle, we could call it, that these times follow. And see if you can relate to Israel. So, for example, the first step in the cycle is an abundance from God. God blesses, God provides, He gives more than is deserved. And we admit, or we recognize, God is a good and gracious Father. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 45, it talks about God sending rain on the just and the unjust. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good. God is a good God. And you've probably thought, how does that person get oxygen to live? They're evil. They're a terrible person. And I mentioned communism, and we think of the tens of millions of people that have been killed, murdered in the last century because of communism. How did they even get the oxygen to live, those evil, wicked leaders? In Matthew 7 and verse 11, again, God's provision. If you, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things to those who ask Him? So God is a good God, a gracious God, and He has a future and a hope for each of us. And so God provides. But then when there's the provision of God, what happens next is the expectation of more. We think it needs to keep coming. We think God needs to come through for us. Last Sunday when we studied the manna in the wilderness, what happened, and we referenced, fast forward to Jesus, what happened after Jesus fed the 5,000 people in the wilderness, outside the city? What happened after that? They came back the next day, and did they want to hear more of His teaching? Did they say, "Jesus, you're awesome. We're putting our faith in you. We trust you for eternity"? No. They just said, "Make some more bread. We need some more." And there's something about when all our needs are met and everything's fine, somehow we just want more. One of the fascinating reactions to those that travel on mission trips internationally is they meet children who have nothing and they can't believe how content they are. And I've heard from many of you, and you're just stunned. Man, they don't have anything. They don't have any shoes, and they got a rag, and they're playing soccer out on a field, and they just got a rag, and it's dirt, and the goal is some sticks propped up there. And they're like as happy as any kid I've ever seen, and they're happier than anybody that I know. If only our kids back home could know this deprivation and could get over their sense of entitlement. And there's something that happens when we start to receive that we begin thinking, "I'm owed this. I deserve this." Our abundance tends to create in us a sense of entitlement. So, out of that entitlement, that expectation of more, the next step is we are disappointed with less. Because we think God should come through for us, and we've done all these great things for Him. He should deliver perfect health for us and a good report at the doctor, and He should deliver good parking spaces for us right up close to the building. And He should come through for us. And why doesn't He? I just can't believe God has let me down like this. This is the thanks I get after everything I've done for Him. And we start thinking that way. And so we complain about our circumstances, and this has happened, and this has happened. And when we start complaining, complaints never stand on their own. We start lumping things together that aren't even complaints. There weren't any until we started grabbing them. Yeah, and you know what? Not only that, this is happening too, and that's happening too, and this too. And if we would just allow the circumstance to stand on its own, it's not so bad. And in the end, God continues to provide strength, and He continues to provide energy, and He continues to provide resources in His way. and in His time. But He longs for us to long for the giver more than the gift. The song we played last week, help me want the healer more than the healing. Help me want the Savior more than the saving. Proverbs 28 and verse 26 says it in a fascinating way. He who trusts in his own heart is a fool, but whoever walks wisely will be delivered. Have you ever heard anybody in our culture say, you just got to follow your heart? We hear that all the time. You just got to follow your heart. The goodness is down inside there. You just got to find it. Follow your heart. The scriptures come along and say the person who follows their heart is a fool. Now, they both can't be right. God or the world. But all we have to do is look out and see people that have followed their heart and seen the addictions that have grown out of that and the broken marriages that have fallen out of that. To say, hey, what happens when you follow your heart? And the damaged children and the broken lives and unemployment. We could make a list. And the list would be because people are following their heart. Just follow your heart. God says you're a fool if you do that. And life says that too, because all we have to do is look at the consequences all around us of people living on their impulse. Because you know what another... follow your heart. You know another way of saying that is obey your impulses. And how many of you has that worked out when you obey your impulses? It doesn't. The movie that's been out, Paul, the Apostle of Christ, there's an interesting scene in the movie where he's in prison there and the prison warden is thinking through spiritual things, but he's kind of skeptical, but he's engaging with Paul, and in one point he's having a conversation, and he says to him, Paul, look at where you are here. A lot of good it's done you to follow your God. You're in prison. And Paul says, I deserve a lot worse. There's something about the entitlement mentality that when God provides for us, we start demanding from Him that He give us even more. But how many of us truly want God to give us what we deserve? Do you want that? All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. God, give me what I deserve. I deserve it. Oh, really? What do we deserve? The expectation, the demanding of right is a distorted way of thinking. We're demanding from God the gifts, the free cookies. Lamentations chapter 3 says it in a fascinating way as well. I always kept one phrase of this text in my mind. It's in verse 22, 23, and 24. Look at how this first phrase is. It is through the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed. When I said, how do those, brutal dictators have another breath of life? How do any of us proud and arrogant people have another breath of life? You see, if God, because we're like, God, do something about the evil in the world. If God was going to do something about the evil in the world, He'd have to start with our own hearts. And there wouldn't be any of us left. It's by the Lord's mercies that we're not consumed. His compassions do not fail. Every morning you wake up to new mercies and compassion from God because His faithfulness is so great. I love this next phrase. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I hope in Him. Help me want the healer more than the healing. Help me want the giver more than the gifts. So we come to Exodus 17. I want to look at a few observations here. Verse 1, they come out and they're out in the wilderness, and they traveled from the wilderness of sin. That's a geographical location. It's not describing their heart condition there. And there was no water to drink. But I want to make this observation first. They are exactly where God wants them to be. Do you see where it says they followed the commandment of the Lord? And what was it God used to guide the Israelites through the wilderness? During the day, it was a pillar of cloud, and at night, it was a pillar of fire. So they're exactly where he wants them to be. I wonder how many times we have been whining about what's happening in life, and God, why have you done this? And look where you brought me. And he's trying to say, you're right where I want you to be. I'm about to create an opportunity here for you. I'm setting up an opportunity for me to work in your life, and I'm keeping you from greater pain, and I'm building in you deeper faith. We learned a few weeks ago the Israelites had a chance at a shortcut to the promised land, and God said, no, there's bad guys there. I'm keeping you from greater pain if we were to go that route. And I'm giving you an opportunity to build deeper faith in your life because Mount Sinai is where I'm taking you. And you're going to meet up with me at Mount Sinai. In 2 weeks, our message is going to be about the Israelites at Mount Sinai and the relationship with God that was what he longed for. So they're right where God wants them to be, to avoid greater pain and to grow them in deeper faith. That's where they are. So, but look at verse 2. Therefore, the people contended with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. The word contended there, I have that underlined. That's a stronger word than complaining. They have escalated their complaints. So we've gone through 4 iterations. We're up to number 5. But it's not the same level of complaining. Have you ever noticed that the whiny, complaining people escalate over time and it gets louder? Parents, the kids, right? The whining, it gets louder and louder. And I hope parents that have whiny kids have recognized that's probably what I sound like to God a lot of times. So they're demanding. And look at how they say it. They contended with Moses and they said, give us water that we may drink. What tone of voice do you think that was in? You think it was hat in the hand, their hands folded? Can we have some water? Give us water. They're now demanding from Moses, give us water. And we aren't asking. Give us water. Verse 4, take a look there. Moses cried out to the Lord saying, what shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me. Talk about escalating. Moses is afraid for his life. He thinks they're out to get him. They probably are. They're not asking. So God does some interesting, how's God going to handle this one? He does it in an interesting way. Verse 5. The Lord says to Moses, go before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel. So God reaffirms Moses' authority and leadership. Moses, I want you to get some of the other leaders. You go up in front and you have something to say to them. But God reminds everybody, Moses is in charge. Moses is the guy. Go before the people. And then if you mark in your Bibles at all, also note, he says, take in your hand your rod with which you struck the river. It's fascinating that the rod of Moses keeps coming up. When he stood before Pharaoh, he threw the rod down on the ground and it became a snake. Remember that? And then when it was time to turn the waters into blood, he put them down there in the water and it turned into blood. When he was at the Red Sea, God said, take your rod and lift up your rod, and the waters parted. And it's such a great lesson in what can God do if we just make something available to him. If we just make our van available to him, or our house available to him, or our finances available to him, or our hammer available to him, or our brains available. Imagine what God can do when we make something available to him. The rod of Moses keeps showing up in this story, and it does again. The next one, letter E there on your notes. God says, verse 6, behold, I will stand before you there on the rock of Horeb and will strike the rock and water will come out of it that the people may drink. And then the next phrase, Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. Look at how understated the next line is. if you struck the rock and water came out, how would you be describing it? Moses just writes a little, and then he did it. And then he did it. Wait a minute. He struck a rock and water started coming out. He did so. Now, the New Testament helps us understand the Old Testament. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, that chapter that said these stories in the Old Testament are for our learning, they're for our example. Verse 4 says this, that Christ, well, they all drank from the same spiritual drink. The spiritual rock was Christ. So when was it that Christ was struck and nourishment and fulfillment came out of it? It was at the cross. This example here is a beautiful picture of the cross where Christ was struck on our behalf and we received the provision of God. Fast forward a generation, about 40 years or so, and the children of Israel are in the wilderness, and they get thirsty again, and God tells Moses to speak to the rock. Maybe you know this account. God says, Moses, speak to the rock. Well, Moses, they've been complaining over and over and over. He's beside himself at their complaints, and he takes his rod, and he strikes the rock twice. Water comes out, but now God's angry with Moses. And he says, Moses, because I told you to speak to the rock and you struck the rock, you will not get to go into the promised land. Sounds like, man, Moses just messed up one time and he's paying the price there. But what was the rock a picture of? Christ. And how many times was Christ struck for our salvation? Once. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 18, it says that Christ suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he would bring us to God. He was put to death in flesh, but made alive in the spirit. He was struck once. And then what do we do after that in order for us to find salvation? Romans 10 and verse 13 says, whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. You see, God calls us to speak to the rock every time after the first time. The rock of Christ was struck once and provided our salvation. That's in Numbers chapter 20, if you care to read there. But after he was struck, we don't have to crucify him over and over and over. We don't have on our cross Christ still suffering on the cross because he suffered once for sins. And the cross is empty. And the tomb is empty. And that's what we celebrate. And now, whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Moses, speak to the rock, and I will provide. Well, verse 7 has an interesting, Moses does an interesting thing after he hits the rock and the water. He calls the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the contention of the place. And Massah means tempted. Meribah means contended, quarreled, argued. He creates a memorial so that they remember the time when they were the big whiners. Now, remember the Alamo. Remember Pearl Harbor. Remember 9/11 we think about. And Moses is saying, remember Meribah. When you doubted God's goodness. Now he says to them, you are putting God to the test. So I want to talk about this for just a minute. What does it mean to test God? They've put God to the test. And it's in the end of verse 2, where he says, why do you tempt God? And Jesus, when he was tempted in the wilderness, one of his responses was in Matthew chapter 4, it is written, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. So what does it mean to tempt or test? Well, this is a legal term here. Picture a courtroom setting, legal proceedings, a lawsuit or a criminal case. And here's what, when Moses said, why do you tempt God? Here's what he's asking. Why are you putting God on trial. Because when we complain, what we're saying is, God, you are not running the universe like I think you ought to be running it. We're accusing God of something. And so I tried to break this down, thinking about it. We put God on trial, and I want to break it down in a way to help you understand, because it helped me understand it. When we're saying, God, why are you not running this universe right? We're making an accusation. That's the first one, accusation or charge. God is not running the universe the way I think He ought to be running it. He's not directing my life. He's not making all the parking spaces work out in my favor. He's not making my family turn out the way I think they should be turning out. And God is not doing things fairly, which by fair we always mean working out for my benefit. Wouldn't you agree with that? This isn't fair, meaning it's not how I would have done it because it's not working out for me just right. So we make this accusation. And then we have evidence. God, you're not running the universe right because of this, this, and this. See, this didn't work out and this didn't work out. I wouldn't have done it like that. I wouldn't have let my loved one get sick and to suffer like that. I wouldn't have let my loved one die so fast and suddenly before I got to say anything. And we go back and forth. And I wouldn't have let that person get sick. And I wouldn't have let that accident happen. And I would have let this person have better brains than they did. And I would have let this... We have all this evidence that we start rounding up that we think God should be running things different. So we arrive at a verdict. We think God's guilty. Guilty as charged. I charged him. I presented the evidence. I rendered the verdict. God should have come through better than He has. And so the sentence is, I'm fading away. I'm going to drop out of church. I'll show God. And how many people have said they're going to show God something, and they slowly drift away in their faith because of something they've accused God of doing that they thought He was being so unfair about. Now, Job tried this. Job was accusing God, and it's in Job chapter 38. I want to read several verses because God has a response to somebody accusing Him. Verse 1. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" In other words, Job, there's somebody here that's accusing me of things. They don't even know what they're talking about. Verse 3. Now prepare yourself like a man. I'm going to question you, and you're going to answer me. God turns the tables in the courtroom. You see? Can you see the legal scene here? Job's been accusing God of being unfair to him. God says, wait a minute, I'm putting you on the stand, Job, and I've got questions for you. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me. Explain, if you have understanding. He goes on the next verse. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know, Job, since you're questioning my running of the universe. Answer me. Give me the answer. And to what were its foundations fastened? Who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy. Job, just answer me some of these basic questions. What's holding everything together? What keeps the earth up there in space? What keeps the sun from not burning up? Just answer me a few of those, Job, since you think I'm not running the universe right. And the point for Job, and it goes on. The new prosecutor, God, goes on with questions that Job, of course, is unable to answer. And the challenge to us is to say, I don't really know what I'm talking about. And God does. So what does it mean to trust Him? It means three I believes. We're going to say, I believe. I believe He's a good God. Our accusations against God go fundamentally to the core of who He is. I doubt that you are a good God, or you would not have done this to me. I doubt that you're a good... And so, I believe. We go back to Matthew chapter 7 again. We read verse 11 earlier. But in verse 9, He says, what man is there among you if your son comes and asks for bread? Will they give him a stone? Or if your child asks for a fish, are you going to give him a serpent? Of course not. And that's why verse 11, then, if you being evil are going to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things to those who ask him? There's some great marriage material called Love and Respect. Emerson Eggerichs is his name, Love and Respect. And one of the things they offer in there, they suggest, is when you're in conflict, he says, assume that your spouse has the best interests of the marriage and has your best interests at heart. It's a fascinating perspective because as soon as we're in conflict, what do we assume about them? You're trying to make me mad, aren't you? You're trying to get at me, aren't you? You're just trying. You're doing that. They're late. They don't call. They did that on purpose. We assume the worst. And we assume the worst of God. That's why in 1 Corinthians 13, there's a list of love characteristics. And one of them is believes all things. Bears all things, hopes all things, believes all things. Love says, I believe the best in my spouse and then in God. I believe he's a good God. Second, I believe he knows far more than I do. He's far smarter than me. He's far wiser. He knows what he's doing. He knows the end from the beginning. He knows what's holding the oceans in place, and he knows what holds the earth in space. He created all that. And so Romans 11, the writer of Romans is just blown away. Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his ways, judgments. They're past finding out. We can't even comprehend. Third, I believe God has a plan and purpose. I believe God has a plan and purpose for this illness. I believe God has a plan and purpose for this job loss, for this job slowdown. I believe God has a plan and purpose. And there's been several times, unfortunately, I've said, next time I go through something, I want to look for the plan and purpose on the front end instead of whining about it through the whole thing and coming out the other side and going, oh, that's what he wanted me to learn. Romans 8 and verse 28, we know that all things work together for the good of those who are called, to those who love him. God intends to bring good out of those circumstances. You see, we all have a longing to try to make sense of things. We all have a thirst to try to make sense of it. We think certain people exist to fulfill us, to complete us. And so far too many people are disappointed and frustrated. They expect the husband or wife to shape up and be the spouse you need them to be. Others are lonely and see themselves as incomplete. Some hope for acceptance into a certain social group, or others to have the circumstances work out just right for them, and they never seem to. Even when things work out, it's like they don't last. It doesn't stay. And a lot of people live with a low-grade frustration or a deeply rooted anger at life for not working out like they hoped, like they expected, like they demanded of God after everything they've done for him. And so when Jesus came along, he tried to say, I'm the answer you've been looking for. I'm the satisfaction to the thirst that you have. He said it two different times in those very words, John 4 and John chapter 7. But I put out in there just John chapter 4, verse 13 and 14. And in that scripture, he said, whoever drinks of this water, is going to be thirsty again. We could say, whoever desperately tries to get accepted in that social group, you're going to get thirsty again. Whoever tries to get a spouse or somebody in particular to love them, you're going to be thirsty again. Whoever thinks if I just get this job, then I'll be fulfilled, you're going to be thirsty again. Whoever thinks if I just could get this situation and circumstance to work out, you'll be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I give him shall never thirst. You see, the water that I give him, Jesus said, will become a fountain of water springing up to everlasting life. It will satisfy. Jesus said he was living water. He's the one we're longing for. And so how about when we come into circumstances, instead of saying, demanding, God, work it all out. How about we say, God, would you do again what you've done in the past? I've seen you work in the past, God. Would you do it again? Take a look at this 3-minute song here as we close. Do it again.